Hi, I'm Kath Bransby. I work for the Steiner Waldorf Schools Fellowship, and I joined the fellowship about 18 months ago in the middle of a rash of really poor Ofsted inspections of Steiner schools. And those poor judgments were partly because of some practice that wasn't as good as it could have been, but also partly because Steiner schools have a really radically different approach to curriculum and a very different understanding of teaching and learning and the purpose and the priorities of education. And that was difficult for Ofsted to understand. So I linked up with Martyn Rawson after he spoke at an online conference we ran just at the beginning of lockdown, and we've been working ever since on different ways to articulate the Steiner Waldorf curriculum and also to reimagine it for the 21st century and beyond. So I'm going to hand over to Martyn and he will take you through the Steiner curriculum.
Thank you, Kath. Martyn Rawson here. I've been teaching in Steiner Waldorf since 1979, when I was one of the co-founders of the York Steiner School. I've now moved and I'm now based in Germany, which has a lot more Steiner Waldorf schools than the UK does. And I'm involved in teacher education, although I still teach young people at school. And I'm also involved internationally in the Steiner or Waldorf schools movement, currently visiting professor of Waldorf education in Taiwan, although visiting means I'm here and they're there. I would like to take you through some key ideas as to what we understand, we Waldorf Steiner people understand by the term curriculum. This curriculum was developed 100 years ago in Germany, in the first Waldorf school, hence the name Waldorf, by Rudolf Steiner, who established this education. And since then, the curriculum has been translated, in a sense, not only into many different languages, but into many different cultures. I think there are Steiner Waldorf institutions in around 70 countries at the moment. And that means not just a question of translating literally in terms of language, but in a sense translating, adopting, adapting to different cultural contexts. And I think what the Steiner schools movement in the UK in particular has bumped up against is that it perhaps hasn't been developing its curriculum further in the way that it needs to be done for quite a long time. That has to do with lack of resources and a lot of other reasons which I won't go into here. But this, in a sense, this crisis presented the schools with an opportunity to look at what we understand by curriculum, to look at what the bottom line, if you like, of our curriculum is, to what extent it can be adapted and modified to changing circumstances, but also obviously how can it adapt in ways which would make it acceptable to current Ofsted inspection regimes. So we started in effect with a position that there is a core curriculum within the Waldorf movement, which is really a set of ideas about child development and about learning, and that in a sense is, at least we take to be generally the case. There are obviously developmental changes that take place through all kinds of intrinsic and extrinsic factors, but for the moment we take this as a given that there are certain developmental processes that we need to take into account. At the same time, we need to take a lot of other things into account, not only the local situation, but the requirements of education in the world today. So putting all this together led us to, in a sense, reformulate and revisit and perhaps reprioritize curriculum as we understand it. I will go into the first slide, which poses the very fundamental question, which I think is always worth asking, is what do we mean by education in the first place? We understand education as essentially a relationship between people. Some people wishing to communicate, to mediate experiences to others, usually younger, who wish to engage with the world and be guided in that, and they wish to be led by someone. I think this formulation that children want, perhaps unconsciously when they're younger, but in a deeper sense, need to be taught something that has a purpose, that they can ultimately experience this purpose, and that they enter into a relationship with someone who helps them, who mediates that towards them, who facilitates the experiences that we call, or the process that leads to what we call learning. And if you look at it from the teacher's perspective, which is sort of a shift of perspective, the teacher's primary task is to draw the child, the young person's attention to what we as an adult world, perhaps we as a society at large, consider to be genuinely relevant and important. We're directing their attention. Education, in a sense, is a directing or a schooling of attention, at which point the learner, the child, the young person, engages with that experience and enters into a transformative relationship with it. So what is education for? Here we take a lead from Gert Biester, who has recommended, if you like, as a model, that all schools have three basic functions. The first one is socialization, and we would like to prioritize the tasks of socialization in terms of being part of a multicultural community. Wherever our schools are, we are embedded in a multicultural community. And this is not something that can be bolted on, tacked on, or just simply assumed to be the case. There are a lot of dispositions and skills and knowledge required to enable us, also children, to be able to adapt the kind of identities that they need to, so that they can really live in a multicultural community. Clearly, we want children to be able to leave school and enter the world and make a positive contribution, whether it's in civil society or in the world of work, for which they need qualification, not just paper qualifications. What Gert Biester means by qualification, of course, is the sets of dispositions and skills and active knowledge that is required to enable us to make, not just cope with, but to be able to make a positive contribution to the world in which they participate in. Clearly, being socially responsible, being able to take responsibility for one's own actions, to be able to take responsibility for the world in which we live in, particularly the ecological world that we live in, is something that individuals can really, in a sense, only develop themselves. Gert Biester refers to this as subjectification. He also refers to it, interestingly, as a kind of quality of grown-upness. In other words, if you like, the aim is that young people leaving school will be in a position to make judgments based on their own insight, based on evidence, based on experience, that will enable them to act in ethical and moral ways. So these three primary functions, if you like, have always been part of the Waldorf approach. Socialization: what kind of person do I need to become to be able to actively participate? What do I need to be able to do? What do I need to be able to know to be able to make an active contribution? And what Waldorf education, Steiner education, would usually refer to as individuation. Biester calls it grown-upness or subjectification. In other words, being able to take on individual responsibility. These are, if you like, the primary aims, and curriculum continuously comes back to that. And just to give you some idea of where this kind of initiative comes from, Rudolf Steiner, who was asked to found the first Waldorf school in the Waldorf Astoria cigarette factory in Germany in 1919, hence the name, he was quite convinced that if society is to be able to not only just simply reproduce itself, but to renew itself, and to not, in a sense, fall back into the problems which had led to, in his day, the catastrophe of the First World War, which he very much described as a catastrophe caused by capitalism. His central idea was that it's not for society, either in the form of the government or in the form of the economic world, to precisely specify what young people have to know and become in order to be able to take part, to take an active role, play an active role in society. In this quotation, which you can perhaps read later in more detail, it's basically saying this generation, if allowed, if given the opportunity to develop their skills and knowledge in an open way, in a non-instrumentalized way, if they can do that, then it's quite likely that they will be able to contribute to the renewal of the society that they're taking part in. This, if you like, is a sort of central idea, which is why Steiner basically said, so who should design curriculum? Effectively, the people who are closest to the educational process. In other words, through, if you like, the peer judgment of people actually directly involved in education. The teachers, but not only just in a smaller sense, in a narrower sense, the teachers in a particular school, but educators, teachers would be designing curriculum because they are in the position to recognize what their children in their particular city, in their particular context, historically bring with them and what they need to develop. So this was an idea that was very much there from the beginning of Steiner education. So within this process, Steiner education takes actually quite a Vygotskian position, without necessarily realizing it, that learning is very much the motor of development. And it's a motor that, in a sense, is self-driven, to mix metaphors. The idea behind learning is that, in effect, learning is a process of self-activity, which in the German language is designated by the term Bildung, which is beginning to become more widely known. But effectively, it means the self-formation of the person in a cultural educational context. That this is very much a process of all education, in a sense, is self-education. You can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, but you can make the water sweet and the horse thirsty. And in a sense, it generate a thirst and a hunger for the experiences which are then transformative. And they need to be accompanied in such a way that the learning experience itself leads to a form of transformative learning. That's the idea behind this self-formation. In the process of doing so, it's a productive process. In other words, one is producing one's own self, one is bringing oneself into being through this process, and at the same time establishing stable relationships to the world, and of course a stable identity or a coherent identity in the process. And because Steiner education takes into account the spiritual dimension, always has done, any form of development, any form of learning has to actually involve body, mind, as we would say in English, and the individuality of the human being, which is the, if you like, the core, that emergent quality in the person which Steiner referred to as spirit. Starting from this kind of picture of self-formation, if you like, structured, organized self-formation, there are a whole series of preconditions, because if body is to be involved, as it obviously is, then there are necessary conditions that the body requires. The body, the embodied body, the ensouled body of the person, the young person, needs to feel fundamentally seen, heard, recognized, understood, accepted, because this enables a kind of bodily sense of protection, of security, of safety, and of trust in the responsible adults around the child. And this requires obviously long-term relationships in the educational setting. I'm now just focusing, if you like, on the development that we can influence directly through education. So this is one of the primary conditions, which is not only restricted to early years, as the picture would suggest. Actually, teenagers, I mostly teach teenagers at school these days, they also have a need to be recognized for who they are. Teenagers with very different backgrounds. I teach in an inner city school in Hamburg. We have a number of young people in the class who have migrant or refugee background. And once they get into puberty, once they get into adolescence, once we've actually managed to find a point at which we can contact, we can see how important it is that school becomes a safe place for them, and that they have people that, in absence of family support and all the rest of it, that can offer them that sort of that continuity of recognition, which is so important to adolescents. So it's not just small children, it's all of us. In fact, we need that. One of the things that Steiner education has always looked for is, because of this close interaction between body and mind, if you like, this psychosomatic aspect, the assumption is that what we do cognitively, emotionally, is bound to have an impact on the body, but other way around. The body and its senses and its relationship to the world through bodily processes needs to be harmonized in order that healthy learning and healthy development can take place. And Steiner spoke frequently about supporting the health-creating forces in the child. And I don't think anybody really understood that until the work of Antonovsky. Antonovsky was an Israeli medical psychologist in the 60s who was charged with the task of building up the public health service in Israel. And in the course of his empirical research, he encountered many people who had survived the Holocaust, who were living in Israel. And he was able to establish that one of the sources of resilience, one of the sources or resources that people have within them that enable them to make the best of the situation that they're in other words, to be able to develop in a healthy way, he identified as these three qualities, which he called salutogenetic, in other words, the origins of the health creating forces or health or well-being, that the indicators for a salutogenetic well-being is that the person, the child, generally has a sense that she understands what's being asked of her, and that it can be understood. It's not just that one understands it, but one can understand it, that it's doable, that it's manageable, that you have the tools, resources, and support to do what's being asked of you, and that you generally have the experience that it's meaningful to invest time and energy in it, what Antonovsky called meaningfulness. Now, how that manifests in children of different ages would be another topic for itself. But this is, if you like, this is a heuristic tool that teachers can use to address, is the curriculum, is the teaching, is the learning situation providing the child with an environment in which she feels, I can understand, it's comprehensible, I can manage, I can do it, or I have the support to be able to do it, and that it's worth me investing my resources within it, in this meaningfulness. And we have worked a lot with adapting ways of using this as a lens to basically evaluate individual lessons, but learning situations, and also teacher health, which is another question that comes into it. So one of these, if you like, one of the ideas that flows from this idea, this interactive body-mind process, is that doing, making, shaping things through arts and crafts particularly, is a process of self-formation in itself. So this idea that in making, in producing, in creating, we are at the same time making, producing, and creating ourselves, to put it rather simplistically. And this is one of the reasons why the arts, and particularly the handicrafts, play such a central role. Now, this is not a new idea in education, of course, and certainly goes back to Pestalozzi. But the idea that making, using fine motor skills and gross motor skills supports the healthy development of cognitive skills is on the one side. But the other side is that all these activities, all these craft activities, initially relate to cultural practices with a deep history. That handicrafts come with a long history of, let's say, a cultural economic history, which is implicit in the tools and the materials themselves. And so connecting through the arts is not only, in a sense, doing something skillful and useful that has a value in itself, but it's also connecting to a historical stream, which is a foundation for understanding, if you like, the post-technological world that we're about to enter into. So learning about different materials, wood, wool, paper, and so on, is not only a matter of schooling powers of observation and tactile skills and so on, but it's embedding that in a cultural context, because these crafts have a history of human practice, which is then later replaced by machines, which is then replaced by robots. But in order to be able to connect to that process and to be able to understand it, Waldorf education has always placed strong emphasis on making artifacts that are literally useful. These are things that get used. I have shelves, I have tools that have been made by my children that I actually use, perhaps not on a daily basis in my current role, but I certainly use them in my tool shed. Another aspect of this, of course, is connecting with the crafts people who carry this stream. So education, if you like, the outdoor classroom includes people with meaningful cultural practices that we can engage with. This is actually a photograph of me working in Taiwan with Aborigine people who work in the Steiner schools there. The aesthetic processes of working with the arts is something which also, if you like, is a chief characteristic of Steiner education. And it's not only just, in a sense, as a balance to head work, but it's actually, the arts are a different way of relating to the world, a different way of understanding the world. And you only really achieve that when you develop a certain level of skill and expertise, which is why children begin learning their flutes and end up being able to play in orchestras and so on. That this is a whole process that accompanies all the other, if you like, more conventional fields of learning and plays a very important role in education. So just to round off here, this participation in meaningful activities. We're going to eat the bread after we've baked it. We're going to wear the slippers that we've sewn, measured, and so on. Or in the case of the 15-year-olds who have perhaps made a suit, yeah, on an electric sewing machine and so on. This connection to meaningful activity, of course, connects them to a world of work and all the ethical issues that go with that. So once you've made a suit or a dress by hand, you have a completely different relationship to all questions about child labor in factories and so on. This is existential because you've, in a sense, you've participated in this cultural practice a little bit and it's changed you. So although we talk a lot about self-formation, a lot of the formation comes through the self-engagement with the practicalities of life, the basics, the elements, and doing real work, which in itself is useful and, as far as we can, is ecologically meaningful. So we're starting from a series of developmental tasks, by which I mean what children, if you like, the stage that they're at and the next things that they need to learn, but also looking at it from the point of view, from a more conventional curriculum perspective, of subject disciplines, which crystallize out of initial themes. The initial themes are have to do with literacy, orality, literacy, and numeracy in the lower primary classes, and gradually out of interdisciplinary themes, for example, like farming and how do we sustain ourselves, where do we get food from. There we're bringing writing and drawing and counting and measuring and a whole series of other, if you like, more geographical concepts into play. Out of that gradually emerges, and I go to the next slide, what can be graphically, in a sense, portrayed here, is that we have themes which in effect have an emphasis of a particular subject discipline. So it could be science, it could be maths, it could be literacy, reading and writing, and so on. And that there is a progression, you can see on the colourful diagram there, the class 1, 2, 3 going upwards. You have themes in each subject which are often interlocked within a topic that we're addressing. And of course, one of the tasks that teachers have is to track the development of the individual subject progressions and disciplines within, if you like, the interdisciplinary projects that they're working on. By the time the children get to 11 or 12, then the timetable now has things called geography or history or maths on it, where you would then focus on those kinds of experiences, but they're still fairly integrated. So we have what we've described here as a macro level framework of themes, which gives us a framework to work with. And if you like, the next level down is a level, what we've called here the meso level, is a framework of skills and dispositions and knowledge, which we expect, and also Ofsted and anyone else expects our children to be capable of, to fold those into the evolving process that we call the curriculum. Now, the children might not necessarily think of it in those terms. Oh, today we're doing history, today we're doing biology, because they might be doing a topic which involves those subjects in an interdisciplinary way. But certainly by the age of 12, they will now have a consciousness that different subjects have different activities and different terminology and different skills that we would track, teachers in a sense, at the meso level. And into this, of course, we bring whatever external requirements are necessary into that. And of course, the individual level is what I teach this particular learning group, that I can justify that upwards by saying I'm covering the following skills and knowledge and dispositions, and it fits into my overall developmental picture. So this, I think, this has helped us to reconceptualize our curriculum, to see it not as just one big thing, but actually to identify that we have core generative principles, we have our developmental themes, then we have, if you like, the progressions of skills and subject matter, and then we have individual teachers saying this child needs this support and this group can be working on this task. So the individualizing of it provides us, if you like, with a three-tiered concept of curriculum. The center part, the meso bit, is the bit where we can compare with national curriculum requirements or anybody else's requirements, because we can speak the same language without losing, in a sense, this primary experience of the developmental progression, the individuation, and all the social processes that go with it.